Thank you very much for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. I want to start by just apologizing to everybody. Not that it's my fault, but I was really hoping when I first received the invitation, I was really hoping to be able to visit in person. And even when we delayed this slightly from October to December, I had the thought, oh, maybe I can go in person. But obviously these days, that's not so easy. So thank you for coming online. And I hope that, yeah, we can have a good discussion. So I would like to just start by getting to know you guys a little bit more. Because yeah, we have a nice amount of time to actually talk and get into some of the topics in Korean history. So yeah, today I guess I'm not going to be talking about modern Korea so much, although I mean, as Johanna kind of hinted, there is a connection between not just, you know, how history shaped modern Korea, but also how some of the events in modern Korea have kind of influenced how we think about the history of the colonial period. And I will be talking about, you know, like a little bit in my presentation. So after we have like this, you know, small discussion, I'm going to give a slightly more formal presentation. And yeah, I'll be talking about how I think some of the focus on landlords in colonial history is a little bit misplaced, but that kind of comes from the post-war experiences of Korea, because, you know, there's a lot of tension between communism and the, you know, the capitalism in North and South, and this then informs the way that people are looking for the past. They want to try and explain some of the roots, right, of contemporary issues, looking at this earlier conflict between different class levels. So that has, you know, definitely influenced the history, although, you know, as I'm going to talk about later, that's definitely not the only thing that's going on. But it's interesting, yeah, Johanna, that you bring that up, because I think if you are interested in that kind of topic, we can kind of see the hints of that in some of the readings. Now, I have a couple more questions for you just to orient ourselves, because this is, you know, I am going to be talking about the colonial period. So I'm curious just to get a sense then of what you guys know as a starting point about the colonial period. Would anybody like to kick us off and just throw out, you know, whatever information you know or don't know about the colonial period, or even questions that you've never quite fully understood? I mean, you know, we have a blank slate, right? I don't know what you know, so please fill me in. What do you know about the colonial period? And there's, yeah, a lot of conflicting experiences and information about the colonial period. The colonial government claimed to be modernizing and developing Korea, and, you know, that's still, there are still people who put forward that narrative, or who try and emphasize some of the developmental impact of the colonial period, but there are others who emphasize also the exploitation that also happened, because there, as Sabina mentioned, you know, there's this very strong repression that happens at different points in the colonial period. So when I'm teaching on the colonial period, I try to break it down into 3 periods for my students, because there's actually a lot of variation. So the first decade of colonial rule, from like 1910 to 1920, is very harsh, very repressive. This is when the colonial government, it comes in and it outlaws a lot of activities. It sets up a military style of police. Koreans are prevented from publishing, with some very, very minor exceptions. Koreans are prevented from publishing. There's a lot of control over the organizations that Koreans can join, whether they can form companies. As I mentioned, the police are very, militaristic at this time. It's like a gendarmerie rather than a civilian police. This changes in the 1920s. Can anyone think of why it might change? Does anyone know what happens in 1919? It's linked. Later people will link this to the Gwangju uprising as like this, long history of popular uprising. But yeah, on March 1st, there is a big independence nationalist movement. So a bunch of Koreans, they write a declaration of independence, and they, protest against the harshness of colonial rule, calling for independence. And this is put down very brutally by the colonial government. Like hundreds of people are killed and imprisoned. But there's kind of a backlash internationally against this. One of the interesting things about the Japanese colonialism is that in addition to whatever it's doing on the ground and within Korea for Japan's own purposes, it's also trying to sell a certain image of itself to Western nations, right? Japan is not just colonizing Korea, it's also trying to prove to Britain, to America, to France, that it is, a fully developed first-rate nation, capable of having its own empire, as Britain, France, America also have at this time. And so when there is this, very public protest and then very violent crackdown, this starts to be criticized in some of the, international media. And this then prompts Japan as well to kind of change its mode of colonial rule and to try and adopt a more ameliorative, slightly more gentle method of colonial rule, moving more to like gentle harmony rather than harsh repression. And so there's a big change from the 1910s to the 1920s. Has anyone heard of what we call this period from the 1920s, where things are a little bit more relaxed for Koreans? In Japanese, it's called bunka seiji. In Korean, it's called munhwa jangchi. In English, it is cultural rule. So this is the term that the colonial government gives for its, more enlightened version of colonialism. And in this time, Koreans gain more freedoms, not complete freedoms, of course. There's still a lot of control and censorship and limitations, but Koreans can publish newspapers again. They can form their own societies. They can form companies. They only have to register their organizations. They no longer have to seek permission. So we see a lot of activity from the 1920s and really the developing of quite a vibrant urban culture. And so there's an outburst of newspapers. Some of the big Korean newspapers, Dolnailbo and Chosunilbo, these are started during this time. And there's a lot of magazine publishing, interest in, fiction. There's new cultural movements. There's the spread of new communications technologies like radio, the beginning of cinema slightly later, and Koreans are participating in this. And so there's a really big interest in the changing society during the 1920s. And yes, this is a period of relative freedom, although I stress the word relative. Things start to change again from the 1930s onwards, as the Japanese Empire continues to expand. In 1931, Japan sets up the puppet state of Manchukuo, and then the spread of empire increases. And as this happens, and as Japan, the Imperial Japan moves slightly more to like a wartime scenario, then controls or life gets a lot stricter again for Koreans. And this is largely seen through the vein of assimilation. Right, the colonial government starts to stress a lot more the need for Koreans to fully become Japanese, to take Japanese names, to use the Japanese language rather than the Korean language in schools and official settings. Although, I mean, of course, it's almost impossible to, fully outlaw all usage of Korean. And interestingly, like in the diaries that I read, we can see even after the name policy, so officially they have to change their names. But when they're writing about themselves and, interacting on a personal level, they're still using some of the Korean names. So it's interesting to see that the limits, right, of where these state policies come in. But there is a lot more, definitely, if you want to participate in society, there's a lot more pressure to adopt the Japanese name in your public dealings, to use the Japanese language, to participate in these ceremonies, these imperial ceremonies, to go and participate in shrines, to show your appreciation for the Japanese Empire. And yes, then there's a lot more crackdown again on organizations. And partly this also comes to just some of the wartime experiences, right? The shortage of goods, rationing, the requirement to submit quotas, all of this as well starts to squeeze the bounds of what is able for ordinary citizens to participate in. So that was a very brief run through of the colonial period. But we've got these three main periods, right? We've got the 1910s that are very harsh, we've got the 1920s that are a bit more relaxed, and then this gradual shift back to very harsh colonial rule again in the 1930s and definitely by the 1940s. What else do you guys know about the colonial period? Is there anything that you would want to add to that, or anything that you've heard that you want to fit into that timeline that we've just very briefly constructed? That actually is a really interesting aspect, because I didn't mention urbanization or industrialization, and these things are happening as well. And so there's quite a bit of research and publications into what is called colonial modernity. And so this is the idea that, on the one hand, we do see some of these changes to sanitation, the growth of cities, the growth of industries, this modern print culture. This is developing in colonial society, but it's not always developing evenly. There are some quite big discrepancies in what the sanitation is like for the Japanese population in Seoul versus what the sanitation is like for the more Korean areas, and there's an awful lot of poverty even in some of these urban areas, as people are struggling to make a living. But yeah, this is also against the backdrop of improved transportation, the introduction of department stores, restaurants. If you're wealthy, there's an awful lot of fun to be had in colonial Keijo or Gyeongsang, right? The colonial name for Seoul. So yeah, this has, and there's a bias in some of the sources too, right? The people who are writing a lot of materials or documenting their lives and leaving records, they tend to be from some of this more urban intellectual elite groups. So yes, I mean, there is a reason why there's been a lot of attention paid to this, because we can read the fashion magazines, we can see the spread of some of this urban culture a little more easily than we can see some of the changes that are taking place in rural Korea. That this is happening. So thank you, Irina, for bringing that up. Does anyone else have anything that you have heard about or that you want to ask about in terms of thinking about the colonial period? There's one big issue that we haven't talked about yet that does kind of
If I can, I also have bachelor thesis that's actually aimed at the colonial period, but I'm focusing on the language.
Mm.
So maybe just that the Japanese government was like gradually erasing Korean language and like trying to make the Japanese as the national language and demoting the Korean as like a foreign one. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, assimilate. Yeah.
Yeah, this is going on, and this is also mapping onto the colonial education system. One of the real challenges for historians is trying to figure out ways to express the complexity of what's happening, because amid all of the negative sides of colonial rule, there are also things happening like the expansion of the education system, right? Even though it's still a relatively small number, I think even by the end of colonial rule, I think it's only about like 30% of students who are receiving the primary education. So it's not a huge number by any means, but it's still a bigger number than it was before. So more people are going to school, receiving some education, and that becomes a source of tension because the colonial government initially, quite interestingly, it can't use Japanese for a lot of its work, because it just, it would make it impossible to rule the country. And I think I have somewhere, I don't know if it's worth showing it to you guys later in the talk, maybe after the break I can dig it out. The very early colonial administrators, they have to be taught Korean. They get like crash courses in Korean, because otherwise how are they going to interact with the people around them, right? The Koreans don't know Japanese. So some of the very early colonial officials have to learn Korean in order to, make their projects happen. And the early schools as well, there's a division of the schools for Koreans and Japanese. And so the Korean schools also operate in Korean, because the goal in the 1920s, remember, is this gentle assimilation. So there's this idea that we teach the values and we teach them modern knowledge. And then once the Koreans appreciate all of these aspects, once we've brought them up to a certain level of development, then they can become Japanese. So there's very interesting ways in which the language policy is developed at different points in time. But definitely, once we get into the 1930s, and the much harsher versions of wartime mobilization, the patience, if we can put it that way, of the colonial administrators is wearing thin. And there's a lot more formal like urging of the use of Japanese language. Kokugo, as they call it, or kuga, like national language, becomes more mandatory in schools first. But also, for the general population, they're also encouraged to, start to understand it. But there's still that tension. I'm again, like I'll bring this up throughout. I'm reading these diaries, and one of the diaries that I'm reading at the moment, it is, so this guy, he is not, he's about 30 in the 1940s, and his children are going to school, but he too is being encouraged to, attend some like Japanese language training sessions to get a rudimentary knowledge of Japanese. But the magazines that the colonial government is sending him, some of these are still being published in Korean, because there's still, a need to communicate. So there's a really interesting tension there. I don't know how much you'll be able to get into that in your thesis, Anna, but it's a really interesting question as well, this use of language. And again, it shows us it's a really neat way of looking at this very, changes in the colonial policy when we get, the gentler period of gentle harmony between Korea and Japan versus stricter assimilation. We can map that through the language policy. And this also leaves, tensions for the Korean population as well. This is, a source of resentment for many, along with the demand to change their names to Japanese. This is not a popular campaign.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the most distressing aspects of the colonial period. And I mean, so the comfort women, obviously, they gain a lot of attention because it is such, a really brutal and harsh imposition. However, we can also see it in a broader sense of the mobilization of the Korean population. It's not just comfort women being dragged in to this wartime system, although this is definitely one of the more extreme examples. But we also see millions of just ordinary laborers also being dispatched to work in Japan, in mines, in factories, to provide labor for the wartime period, as well as military conscription of Korean young men to go fight in the Imperial Army. That's also happening. And so, yeah, like it's part of this really big mobilization of the population during the wartime period. And yeah, I mean, the subsequent difficulties in getting that recognized also bring us to some of the post-war politics, which is a whole other kettle of fish. So I'll try not to talk about that too much. But there is a really great article. I don't know if you've heard of it, by Kyung Gak Min. I'll find it in the break and share it with you. But this is a really great article that discusses some of this post-war, difficulty of dealing with the comfort woman issue, because unfortunately as well, like there are prejudices in Korean society that these women have to face when they come back, right? After having gone through that horrible ordeal. There's, yeah, a lot of stigma and silence and unwillingness to recognize what they went through within Korea as well as within Japan, and overcoming that is another part of the story. Any other questions or topics that we haven't talked about?
Yes. Interesting. What do you think, if Korea would ever be able to gain independence if it wasn't for the Second World War? If they ever just get out of the influence of Japan without the war?
That is almost an impossible question. But interestingly, it's one that really animated a lot of the colonial era intellectuals. So prior to colonization, so for 5 years before Korea formally became a colony, before it was formally annexed by Japan, there was this 5-year period where Korea was a protectorate of Japan. And so the Japanese government sent advisors to the Korean government. And so even though nominally the Korea was still had its own government, it was very much being directed by some of these prominent figures from Japan. And we also see the loss of the independent military and independent diplomacy during the protectorate period. So, the screws are tightening, if you will. But during this period as well, there's a lot of discussion from Koreans who can see, this impending controls. How do we maintain independence? And this conversation continues into the colonial period. And it's one of the issues that really creates some divisions among Koreans. The March 1st movement is one of the few, like, very clear-cut, very united expressions of that desire for national independence. But most of the time throughout the colonial period, intellectuals and aspiring nationalists, they're struggling amongst themselves, often more than they are struggling against the Japanese, trying to figure out what's the best way to achieve that independence. And so there are some who take a more gradual, moderate approach, and they kind of make the case that Korea was colonized because we didn't have some of these modern industries, we didn't have a strong economy, we didn't have a modern education. We need to get those within the colonial system in order to achieve independence at a later point, right? Set yourself up to become a strong country. So some of these figures, they kind of advocate working within the system, which gets really difficult, right? Where you draw the line between working within the system with working with the system. And some of these more moderate figures, they will later, be castigated and challenged as, for their collaboration with the colonial regime. There are other groups that are more combative and want to, have more physical independence. So we see, especially from the 1930s, guerrilla activities in Northeast China, who are, trying to, physically oppose, militarily oppose some of the Japanese, but it's, from a difficult place of like organization. There's also the Korean Provisional Government. So after the March 1st movement, a group of, some of the main figures, they set up a parallel government, a government in exile for Korea, which is initially based in Shanghai, but then, moves around a little bit in China during the Chinese wars. And this group, they focus a lot on diplomacy, right? Trying to get external recognition of the Korean independence cause, but that, is not necessarily effective because, America and Britain and some of the big European powers, they're not interested in dismantling colonies because they've got their own colonies that they also want to maintain. So the activities of the provisional government are another way we can see some of this division. And then there's one more group, or one more big group. There's lots of alternative ways to address this question. But one group that's also noteworthy are the budding communist and socialist intellectuals, because how, according to the socialist thought at this time, imperialism is an outgrowth of capitalism, right? It's this desire for capitalists to get more markets, get more materials, more resources that fuels the imperial adventure. And so there's this, international socialist movement to try and oppose capitalism as a way of opposing some of the imperialism. And this gets a lot of support among some circles within Korea. And one of the ways you can see this there's a lot of socialist fiction, right? Because they're trying to, drum up support and interest. And so there's a lot of like really cool short stories that are published in the 1920s from some of these socialist figures who are trying to, just express some of the harshness of the colonial system and the capitalist system, and in doing so gain support for their cause. And this group really does then start to have conflict with some of the more moderate figures. There's a movement in the early 1920s, the Korean Products Promotion Movement, and so this is like just a buy local campaign, really, right? It's encouraging Koreans to, stop buying Japanese goods, buy Korean goods, support Korea, and in doing so, we'll help ourselves. And it's inspired by one of Gandhi's movements in India, against the British colonial rule, trying to support local producers from being undercut by these, big, powerful international colonial-backed businesses. The problem, though, is that some of the Korean businesses, some of the Korean goods that the consumers are being urged to buy are more expensive than the Japanese goods, right? There's a reason why people are buying some of the Japanese goods, and it's not because people, are secretly supporting imperial rule. It is, just on a practical issue, it's cheaper. And so there's a lot of questions that get raised. Also, I mean, some of the big supporters of this Buy Korean movement come from some of the big Korean businesses that are, struggling to get a footing and struggling to compete. So they love this campaign. They love, being able to advertise their goods and use some of this nationalist sloganing to encourage consumers to support them. And so then, a lot of the socialist intellectuals start complaining and charging some of these, larger Korean businesses with, the hypocrisy of their movement, that, these businesses are exploiting workers even worse than some of the Japanese businesses. They are the problem, not or the problem is, the capitalist system in general, rather than, just the question of nationalism and who owns which set of corporate profits. So yeah, there's a lot of division there. And this then, obviously, the growth of socialist thought within colonial Korea has a lot of implications for the post-colonial period as well. And yeah, a lot of this can be tied back to this question of, can Korea achieve independence? It's a really tricky question. Personally, I almost think it's the wrong question to spend too much time on, even though, I mean, people, there's a natural instinct to ask that question. And a lot of people have asked that, even during the colonial period itself. But I mean, Japan is the one doing the colonizing. I think that, I think putting the onus on Koreans to, liberate themselves is very difficult when international society, the international political system is not supporting Korea. I think that that's a hard limit. The colonial government, the final responsibility has to come back to the actions of Japan. And so, starting to, blame one group for getting the wrong strategy in looking for liberation is almost, it's an unfortunate misdirection from some of the other issues. But that's my personal opinion. I don't know if you guys, you're free to develop your own arguments on this. Are there any other questions or topics that you guys have lingering about the colonial period?
Well, I know that today's K-pop is kind of thanks to Japan, because in 1920s they mixed traditional Japanese music with like Western music, and they brought it to Korea, and it's known as the throat music. And that's like when it all started, when they started to like mixing traditional music with like Western music. And I know that Japanese also brought like radio stations to Korea, and they started like recording industry. So that's interesting too.
Yeah. The trot issue is interesting because this goes into the post-colonial period as well. Park Chung-hee tries to or after the colonial period, we see various attempts to try and clear out the music system and remove some of these elements, although it's very popular. It's catchy, it's fun, this is what people want to hear. So yeah, it's one of these difficult colonial legacies. And so one of the things that you'll see in a moment when I give my lecture, one of the things that I think we need to do is kind of decouple what the government is doing from, you know, some of these other trends, because, you know, yeah, radio was introduced during the colonial period, but you can't never listen to the radio again. There's lots of ways that people can use the radio and use music. Unfortunately, people can get a lot of political capital for drumming up certain nationalistic arguments, right? If you are maybe an authoritarian ruler who doesn't want to introduce too many questions about your you know, running of the economy and your harsh treatment of workers in the 1960s and the 1970s, it's a lot easier to, you know, get popular support for showing, you know, how anti, you know, trot you are, and trying to, you know, make the music more Korean. So yeah, a lot of this does bleed into the post-colonial period. All right, it's about past. Thank you. I hope that was helpful. I feel it could have been a bit scattered, but it's been really interesting to, yeah, build this picture of the colonial period with you guys, and yeah, build up a general framework that I hope will be useful for this next part of our session. So yeah, I have a slightly more formal talk that I'll give. I will share my screen, one moment. Here it is. And so, can everybody see that? I can't see you anymore, so you have to talk. Say yes, yeah, if you can see.
I can see just fine.
Great, thank you. Let me just reorganize a couple of things on my screen. All right, so yes, this is a slightly more formal presentation now, and I will be talking a little bit about my research, and then after the break, hopefully we can, yeah, continue to talk about this and get back to some of your interests as well and see where these things line up, how we're thinking about the colonial period, and stuff like that. So I have to apologize slightly. One of the difficulties when Andreas gave me, or Dr. Sherman gave me extra time to prepare the presentation, that gave me an opportunity to bring in more of my research. So I've changed the content slightly. I'll be talking a little bit less about finance and a little bit more about agriculture. But again, we can get back to this in the Q&A afterwards if you really want to know about the sources of credit during the colonial period. We can definitely talk about that more with you later. So my talk today is Empire by Association, the reorganization of the rural economy in colonial Korea. And I just want to start by just explaining why I focus on agriculture. Because I think, you know, from what we talked about, there's a lot of, you know, exciting topics that aren't about agriculture, but I do look at agriculture in my research, and there are a couple of reasons for this. One being that this was the most important economic activity within Korea for a lot of its history. Like most pre-industrial societies, Joseon Korea, so the government from 1392 to 1910, it was an agrarian society. Agriculture was the main activity. And even despite the changes and the growth of urbanization and industrialization during the colonial period, even by 1945, more than 2/3 of the population are still engaged in agriculture. So if we want to know about colonial Korea, agriculture is one of the really important topics that we need to look at. I'm also interested in agriculture, though, because it was an important focus of colonial policy. The colonial government, it instituted multiple policies related to agriculture. attempting to boost production and change the goods that are being produced to make Korea a useful resource for the rest of the Japanese empire. So looking at agriculture, as well as telling us about the Korean population, it's also important to tell us about the colonial state and what the colonial government is doing. Because there were a lot of changes to agriculture throughout the colonial period, despite the traditional image that can sometimes be associated with agriculture. And that's why I chose the readings that should have been shared with you by Dongmo Kim and Takanori Matsumoto and Seung-Jin Jung, because there's a lot of previous research into rural society that has focused on the question of landlords and tenants, right? The conflict between these two groups, as well as a lot of accounts of the exploitation associated with colonial rule. But I think the articles that you guys looked at, hopefully, they are useful because they give us a lot of details. And so they allow us to build a bit of a broader picture of what rural Korea does look like under colonial rule. And they also do a good job of acknowledging some of the changes that did take place, which, as we talked about in terms of, schools, radio, music, this has been a very difficult question for historians. Is it a good or a bad thing that the colonial government invests in new agricultural technologies, or that there are new sources of finance available during the colonial period? That's not always a simple yes or no question, depending on how these new technologies or new sources of finance are applied, or the subsequent implications of some of these modern changes. So my talk today and my research in general, it builds on this perspective to think about the transformation of agriculture, right? I take the existence of these changes as a starting point, but I also then want to explore what these changes look like, what the state's role was in introducing some of these new forms of agricultural production, and what that meant for farmers. Now, as you can also see in the readings, there's still a lot of emphasis on the role of landlords as some of the major agents, either the Japanese landlords that are receiving certain benefits and priorities within colonial policy, or the Korean landlords who may be driven by their class interests to collaborate with the colonial government. But in this sense, I do want to just note that some of this emphasis, I would argue, is misplaced, or at least overstated. There's a lot of variation among landlords. When we say landlords, it's easy to imagine, some of these huge landlords presiding over, really big agricultural estates. But a lot of the important targets of colonial policy are not these extremely wealthy landlords, but far more average landlords, or not even landlords, but just small-scale cultivators of their own land, some of whom might also be tenants themselves, right? It was very common for someone to have a field that they owned, but also rent out land, additional land. So you could have this like mixed status. So I think we do need to be aware when we're talking about, or who we're talking about, when we create this very broad category of landlords. I'm also mildly cautious about how much emphasis we want to place on, the presumed class identity of landlords. Now, this might be very important when we want to think about how landlords interact with tenant farmers, but we also need to be aware that there are other factors that influence the decisions outside of that relationship, such as what do farmers grow and when? How do they engage with the rural economy? How do they engage with some of these new markets for crops that are developing throughout the colonial period? The adoption of some of these new production techniques, etc. And to this end, perhaps one of the unintended consequences of this focus on landlords has been a neglect of thinking about the role of the colonial state. And this has led to both an under and an overemphasis of the power of the colonial government. And I say this, I want to say it's an underemphasis, because if we try and explain some of these changes by looking just at the behavior and the interests of landlords, then there's presumably no need for the colonial government to engage in extensive education and outreach programs. But it did. from the very beginning of colonial rule, the colonial government is very active in trying to implement these policies and try and develop this participation from the general population. So we need to understand that aspect, which does disappear if we, just assume that landlords are going along with colonial policy based on their class interests. At the same time, there's also an overemphasis on the power of the colonial government, because again, if we take landlords as automatically aligned with colonial policy, this assumes that there's willing compliance and that the colonial government doesn't face any pushback from its policies. And again, this was just not the case. There are lots of instances of failure of the colonial government setting ambitious targets that just don't get met, as well as just unintended consequences of some of the colonial policies. So my research, it tries to address these questions by trying to think about how the colonial government implements its agricultural policies. And I do that by looking at the organizations that the colonial government used to try and implement its policies, right, to try and capture that moment of interaction where we can see some of the limits of the colonial policies. So I call those semi-governmental organizations. I'll talk about those in a little bit. I also rely on farmers' diaries to try and see what the farmers themselves made of these changes. Now, I don't have time in this presentation to go into full details about the diaries that I'm using and the authors, but I'll try to throw in a couple of examples during this lecture part about how we see different ways in which the farmers engage with the colonial organizations and policies, and we can also talk about this more in the Q&A if you do want to know more about these sources. So, what organizations am I talking about? I'm looking at a particular group of organizations that I call semi-governmental organizations. So agricultural associations, financial associations, cotton cultivation associations. In general, these were given the name Chohap or Kumiai in a lot of sources. And some of these, they are mentioned in the articles that you read. But they're not all Chohap and Kumiai, unfortunately. Some of them are various, like Hue, the non-Hue, the agricultural organization. So it's not just a terminology, but we can see some common features among these organizations that I think means that we can look at them together. And these features are connections to the local government. A lot of these organizations, they are organized within an administrative district, so at the county or at the township level, and very often as well, the head of the county or the head of the township will become the head of the association. So they do overlap very closely to the local administration. They also receive legislative support, right? The government passes regulations enabling their formation, and sometimes also financial subsidies from the colonial government for their work. They also maintain connections with other parts of the colonial government. So if we want to think about personnel, right? These organizations, they hire agricultural technicians, they have connections to some of the government-managed agricultural experiment stations and model farms through which they receive materials. Their activities also are very closely connected to colonial policy. So if I can just give you an example here, thinking about the cotton cultivation associations. In 1912, the colonial government, the Governor General, announces this directive for the encouragement of cotton cultivation. And the following year, South Challa province, I'm sorry, the text is so small, but this is South Challa province issuing some model regulations for the formation of cotton associations. And then these other provinces follow South Challa's lead and develop very similar forms of cotton associations. And the content is very similar. We can see, a direct connection. The cotton associations are promoting the same type of cotton, upland cotton. They're promoting similar objectives in their activities. And so we get the statement later in 1926. An official writes, "It's no exaggeration to say that cotton promotion in South Jeolla province is carried out entirely through the cotton associations." So these are clearly very important for the colonial government as the semi-governmental aspect. But I only call them semi-governmental rather than governmental organizations, because one of the really important goals of these associations is also to engage the population with colonial policy. They're really concerned with expanding membership as one of their really important objectives, which makes sense if you think about it. If the goal is to spread cotton, certain types of cotton cultivation among the population, but you've got to get the population to then be members of the organization. So we see these associations actively recruiting for members. The Agricultural Association and the Financial Associations really put effort into this in the early years. And the Cotton Association kind of bypass that by making it automatic that all cultivators of upland cotton within a district were automatically eligible for membership. So there's a lot of local participation in these organizations. And even though the highest leadership of these organizations, it does then have these connections to the official government, the management of the group still has a lot of opportunity for members to take part in elections. Each of these organizations, they tend to have a council. So there's the leader, but there's also a council made up of, 10 prominent figures within the association. And although some of the areas in which these organizations are operating, they can be dominated by Japanese landlords, many of these areas, they still have a lot of representation of Koreans in these positions. And, in the early years of colonial, even throughout colonial rule, a lot of the lower levels of government are staffed by a lot of Korean figures. So there's a lot of, blurring of the lines there. There is a bias toward elites in some of these organizations, but this does vary, especially as the colonial state attempts to get more of the population involved in later periods of colonial rule. So in the 1930s, for example, the financial associations, they go from having about 25% of the population as members. So, that's a small group. It's tends overrepresented with elite figures. But by 1935, 50% of the population is affiliated with the financial associations. And this gets even higher under wartime mobilization. We can see the Agricultural Association too. In 1926, it is reorganized from a much smaller organization that does have this very, elite bias to a much broader organization where even tenants are forced to become members. Now, this is not necessarily welcomed by the tenants who now have to pay fees to the association. And this doesn't necessarily lead to greater democratic representation within the associations of these poorer tenant farmers. But we do have to recognize that the impact of these organizations, it goes beyond just the elite landlords. So if I can give you an example of how they worked, I want to go back to the cotton associations that I mentioned earlier. And that 1912 directive that I showed you on the screen, it was really intending to introduce a new variety of cotton, upland cotton, to Korea and increase its cultivation for export to the Japanese industry. And to that end, the plan listed 5 goals at the end of the directive to encourage the cultivation of this new type of cotton through lectures, raising awareness, providing an infrastructure and seeds. It also encourages the farmers to preserve the seeds and maintain the purity of this new crop. It sets out instructions for the guidance to farmers. It sets out the intent to expand the area that will be cultivated by this new crop, as well as improving the methods of cultivation. And this is all then with the broader goal of developing this particular type of cotton as a supply for Japanese industry. Now, as I mentioned before, the cotton cultivation associations, they effectively become responsible for putting these plans into practice. And so we can see in the regulations of the cotton associations, all of the cultivators of upland cotton within the district of the cotton association automatically become eligible as members of these associations. And then through these associations, these farmers, they receive seeds. They receive an initial set of seeds for free, but then it's their responsibility to then preserve the seeds, and the association monitors that progress and even engages in like periodic seed exchanges to make sure that the quality of seeds remains high. There are also rules to prevent farmers from growing other types of cotton, which might then cross-fertilize and diminish the quality of the upland cotton that the government is trying to promote. The cotton associations also oversee production. So they keep track of their areas cultivated. They assign agricultural technicians to talk to members, to host lectures, to educate members on the best way to grow this new crop. The associations, they also organize sales of the crop. Members of the associations, they were obligated to sell their upland cotton through the associations rather than through other channels. And they are also then playing a role in managing the quality of the crop. One of the reasons why the associations want to encourage members to sell their cotton through the associations is so that they can inspect it, right, and make sure that it's of a certain quality at the point of sale. And so there's also guidance on managing the quality of cotton during the cultivation process as well. So this was very brief, but I hope that you can see just from these brief points that the organizations, they're not just about increasing cotton cultivation per se, but they're also trying to change farmers' methods and even their approach to farming. The desired model for cotton cultivation is based on the idea of commercial farming, where the crop is sold. And this is pretty representative for a lot of colonial agricultural policies. We can see a similar focus on commercial cultivation in a lot of the other organizations that are championed by the colonial government for barley, rice, sericulture, livestock. So I'll show you a couple of examples. So this is a report on a barley association in Miryang County, and this was organized under the financial association in the region. And the interesting feature here is that the financial association, it explicitly linked the farmers and these growers of barley to a brewery in Japan, and it facilitates a contract so that these farmers will like regularly not just grow barley and do what they will with the crop, but they'll grow barley and then they'll send it regularly to this brewery in Meguro quarter. So I really want to track down this brewery at some point. It's a future research opportunity when we're able to get back into Japan. We can also see an example through, this is through the Agricultural Association this time. So this is a picture from 1927 when the South Chungcheong Province Agricultural Association sent a delegation of its members to an industrial exposition in Fukuoka in order to promote the sale of its members' rice. They set up a table, they invited attendees to like try Korean rice, all with the intent of like, you know, boosting sales and developing some of these trading connections. And we see another example here, again from the financial associations. So this was a poster made by the South Gyeongsang Financial Association, which is basically encouraging its members to raise chickens as an additional activity to earn money for themselves. So overall, the colonial government, it puts a lot of its effort into the promotion of commercial agriculture, getting farmers to sell more of their crop in general, but also to Japan. Is the colonial government successful in this project? Well, that depends on how we look at things. So to go back to the example of cotton cultivation policies, on one hand, we can say that the government was relatively successful. This map here shows the area of cotton cultivated divided by type. The yellow is the upland cotton cultivation, and the pinky orange color is the local cotton, so the alternative variety of cotton that was previously being grown in Korea. And within a decade, by 1918, nearly all of the cotton grown within the southern provinces has been converted to upland cotton. So even though there's some like local cotton that continues to be grown, this is being grown in the northern provinces. There's a like limit based on climate for the area that can cultivate upland cotton, and pretty much the entirety of the cotton grown in this lower zone is upland cotton by 1918. And so the remainder of this pinky orange cotton is coming from the northern regions. We can also say it's successful because the area cultivated, it does increase very dramatically. From 1918 through to 1925, the colonial government pretty much achieves its targets of the area that it wants to get cultivated. But not all of the farmers sell their crop as planned. This turns out to be much harder to enforce. So scholar Chung An-gi, he analyzed the joint sales through the cotton associations, which is the method, right, that the associations are trying to force their members to sell through. And we can see that there's a wide variation in the best provinces. They achieve about 50% of the cotton grown is, sold through the joint sales in the cotton associations, but other provinces have much lower rates, sometimes 0 to 10 to 20%. A lot of the cultivators of this cotton, they don't sell it and they keep using it within the household instead. There's also, you may have spotted this on the previous slide, a quite dramatic decline in cotton cultivation from the late 1920s. And this is because the price of cotton in global markets drops significantly. And in response, a lot of farmers, they just stop cultivating the crop. And it only really recovers under the very strict wartime mobilization when the colonial government engages in a lot more coercion to achieve this increased output of cotton. So Korea never becomes a significant source of cotton for Japan. So not all aspects of the original policy are achieved. And this gives us some clues, I think, as to the difficulties as well as the breadth of the project that these agricultural organizations are engaged in. The colonial policies for agriculture were very ambitious, and they included behavioral change as well as these material targets for production and export of rice or cotton. And even when we think about the policies that target elites and landlords, in the earlier decades of these organizations' management, these aren't always achieved. Even the elites and the landlords are not always doing what the colonial government wants. And looking at some of the details of the implementation of the colonial agricultural policies, it also helps us think about what some of the implications of these policies might have been for farmers whose behavior the government was trying to change. And so I just want to give you 3 brief examples. Now, the first example gets back to this idea that the colonial government wanted to alter market activity and trading relationships, right? When I was talking about the cotton associations, it required members to sell the cotton that was not being used within their households through the associations. But these new sales patterns, they don't take place against a blank slate. This isn't just about establishing new places for Koreans to sell their cotton, but it also has implications for the existing patterns of sales and the existing relationships that farmers had with merchants. And so to that end, the cotton associations become very interested in ending the practice of so-called greenfield lending, AKSE. And so this is the practice by which farmers they would sell their crop in the spring prior to the harvest. And often this was done because farmers, they were short of money and they desperately needed cash. So they would sell their crop early and then get a loan to tide them over until the harvest point. But colonial officials, they claimed that this was a problem because it enabled merchants to take advantage of these impoverished farmers who desperately needed money, and thereby accepted lower prices than they might receive if they waited to sell the crop through other channels. The solution that the cotton associations developed to challenge this practice was to offer loans for cultivators through the financial associations. So in effect, they're just changing the source of the loan from merchants to these semi-governmental organizations, which is maybe not so different in terms of the practices that the administrators want to claim that they want to change. Farmers are still obliged to sell their crop to repay these loans, but the trading relationships are changing from dealing with Korean brokers to these new channels. And this example is instructive because it shows us some of the difficulties that the colonial government faced in developing its version of commercial agriculture. In many cases, the sales routes that the government was promoting, it had to compete with existing trading and market relationships. If the financial associations also adopted some very ambitious plans to sell their members' crops. But if you read some of the early reports on the attempt to set up these new trading relationships, they reveal multiple complaints about how difficult it is because farmers simply find the location of the financial associations very inconvenient. Often, if there was one office in the county or the township, that was nowhere near as convenient for the existing traders and market locations that farmers were used to visiting. There were also difficulties in language barriers, as well as a lack of the personal relationships that eased some of these patterns of sales. And so we see the continued presence of lending and trading outside of the channels that these organizations are attempting to set up. A second interesting feature of the associations is their entanglement with many other sub-organizations that spring up within individual villages. So the reach of the colonial state, it doesn't end in the semi-governmental organizations, but it becomes linked to a wide range of village level organizations that merge some of the activities promoted within the semi-governmental organizations with village organizations and the social dynamic of villages. So I have some examples here, again, for thinking about cotton. This is from a 1931 report on cotton cultivation in 3 villages. And as an appendix, the publication lists the numerous organizations in each village. And so if we want to look at Okdang village, and this is in South Cholla province, there is, cotton propagation fields that are contracted under the Cotton and Agricultural Association in both Okdang Village and Kumho Island. But there's also a cotton cultivation group, which manages the joint purchase of fertilizers under the supervision of the Agricultural Association, but is managed within the village. In Okdang Village as well, one of the first farmers who cultivated upland cotton, Lee Dong-hyun, he was the head of the Revitalization Society within the village, which was another project of the colonial government, which aimed to improve industry, encourage savings, improve lifestyles. And under the auspices of the Revitalization Society, influential figures within the village encouraged the joint cultivation of cotton, the maintenance of improved seed varieties, the joint sale of crops, all of the things that the cotton associations want to be doing as well. There's also a Diligent Farmers Mutual Aid Association, which provided financial support for village residents who were not members of the financial associations, while again, the cotton cultivation group, it arranges the purchase and distribution of fertilizers. We can see similar webs of these organizations in Kwangjung village, which reinforce the various cotton production activities. So in addition to the Revitalization Society and a Cotton Cultivation Improvement Implementation Association, These two organizations, they encourage village residents to jointly cultivate cotton and save money and purchase fertilizers, while the General Agricultural Improvement Association also promoted the adoption of improved cultivation techniques for all crops, including cotton. And villagers who joined the Diligence and Thrift Association also pledged to commit savings from the sale of their cotton harvest, which they forwarded for deposit at the local financial association. Individuals also play roles here. So it's not just landlords who are engaged in these organizations, but teachers, clerks, figures who have connections to the colonial government, other prominent residents. And so they all make the promotion of cotton at the local level a very blurry gray zone between colonial policy, semi-governmental organizations, and the informal relationships and village organizations that start to get intermingled. And this then brings me to the third aspect that I want to consider, which is the question of just why? Why might individual farmers engage or not with some of these activities? Now, obviously, there is the aspect of self-interest, right? The profit motivation attempts to enrich themselves. One of the main figures credited with spreading upland cotton cultivation in Kwangjung village that I just talked about, Mr. Cho Jong-hyuk, in the year of the survey of his village, he earned 280 yen from the sale of cotton. So it could be profitable, but this is not always, nor is it the only question that can motivate farmers. Another of the figures that I study, Chung Kwan-hye, he branches out into sericulture, which is another of the areas promoted under colonial agricultural policies. And he wants to cultivate mulberry trees, which is an important food source for silkworms, because he saw that it was getting harder and harder to subsist and get by due to the cultivation of grains alone. So he wrote in his diary, "These days life is becoming more difficult. Simply working in agriculture is not sufficient. Beyond the main industry, one must also have a secondary employment. I hope to have a mulberry sapling field." And he's writing this in the mid-1920s when he's facing some increasingly volatile rice prices as a result of Korea's increasing trade connections with Japan and even global markets. Korea then starts to experience wild shifts in the price of agricultural goods in the 1920s, and the collapse of cotton prices that I mentioned in the late 1920s. This was part of a more general global phenomenon of falling agricultural prices. But then this is something that drove him to adopt one of these new forms of commercial agriculture that the government was promoting. So it's not always just about profit as much as, you know, the push factor as well as the pull. We can also see individuals start to get involved with the semi-governmental organizations and aspects of colonial policy in relation to the education and employment opportunities. Working for the financial associations was one of the rare paths toward employment for Koreans who had gone through the new education system. And Park Jun-ho, who was the head teacher of Dongsan Commercial High School, he wrote and complained in 1926 that despite their education, graduates of his school struggled to compete against their Japanese counterparts. And the financial associations were one of the rare outlets of employment. And of 14 recent graduates of the school, 6 found employment within the financial associations. We can see this in the agricultural associations too. After these get expanded in 1926, there's a large-scale recruitment of a new cohort of agricultural technicians. And the South Chungcheong Provincial Agricultural Association very kindly published a list of the employees of the agricultural associations in each of their counties. And so I've just got 2 examples here, Poryong and Puya. And you can see that the vast majority of these technicians, they're Koreans. There's only 2 Japanese names in the Puya Agricultural Association, and pretty much all of the Poryang Agricultural Association are Koreans, for whom employment as an agricultural technician is a meaningful career opportunity. In particular, I just want to highlight this name, Chang Young-ja. She was a woman who received sericulture training. And so she's been employed by the Agricultural Association as a sericulture technician. And so this was, yeah, a really rare opportunity for someone like Chang Young-ja. It's very difficult to get employed as a woman back then. This is also a source of education and training, not just employment. Some of the new technicians in the South Chungcheong agricultural associations, they are invited to this event where they get trained on various aspects of agriculture, fertilizers, land improvement, inspecting grains. And this then, helps them develop their career in education. Of course, the colonial government, it also tries very hard to incentivize participation with its policies as well. And we can see this through the example of prizes given for farmers who produce, good quality crops. So there were lots of these product fairs that were organized at the township, the county, sometimes the provincial level too, where farmers could earn prizes if they had grown particularly good crops that year. And so I have a poster here on the right of a cotton fair in North Cholla province, and the prize for the first place is 100 yen. That was like a substantial amount of money at the time. So that would have been very attractive for farmers. And then here as well, we can also see a certificate on the left of someone who won first place. They didn't receive 100 yen at this time. They just won a prize of 5 yen, but still, that's not insignificant. And they really weren't meaningless activities. In one of the diaries that I'm reading, the one that I showed you earlier, Chebyeongje Ilki, the author, he attended these fairs as an audience member. He notes in his diary about how one of his acquaintances won a prize at one of these fairs, and he brings like his flag to show Che. He's clearly proud about it, and Chebyeongje also thinks it's meaningful enough to write in his diary. And he even then has his own desire to submit to these competitions. Even when wartime mobilization was becoming quite extreme in 1942, and Che has been arguing with local officials about some of the demands placed upon him to expand cotton cultivation and sericulture. In 1942, his brother had a good year cultivating silkworms. And his response is that, these are so good, I want to submit these to Jeonju, to one of the competitions to see if his brother will win a prize. So there's, motivating factors built into the colonial system as well. But yes, of course, among this mix, there is also coercion on the part of the colonial government, although this is most prominent in the early and later parts of colonial rule, in the very early first decade, as well as during the wartime mobilization period. We do see much stricter coercion. But this coercion, it's not only coming from the colonial government, fellow Koreans get involved sometimes. There's an example of an article in the Dongailbo, which is, complaining about this, very harsh case where in Yanggwang County, a farmer had his cotton crop destroyed for violating the rules of the Cotton Association. And the people behind the destruction is the Cotton Association employee, Mr. Shin, the township clerk, as well as 20 students of the local school. And they basically jump into his field when they spot his violation and just destroy the crop. So there's a lot of, different versions of coercion at different times. So to conclude, I've given you a lot of information here, and I hope this hasn't left your head spinning too much. But I also think part of me wants to give you all this information because I think it is necessary to recognize just how complex the implementation of colonial policy can be during the colonial period, and the breadth of issues that are affected by these attempts to transform Korean agriculture, to promote commercial farming, and to introduce these new sources of finance and technology. Amidst all of this, though, we can discern some patterns. And the main point I want to emphasize is the importance of these semi-governmental organizations in mediating these new patterns of agriculture. They are a source of materials, money, seeds, tools, knowledge, as well as being a conduit toward new patterns of trade, even if that is in competition with its existing patterns. And their very active interventionist presence on behalf of the colonial government's agricultural policies. So the associations, they're at the forefront of attempts to change farmers' cultivation practices and even their engagement with commercial agriculture. Even when landlords are seeking their own self-interest, they're being channeled through these organizations that are directing their activities in a certain way. So we do have to recognize the role of the colonial state. This, though, it can be a very broad and blurry presence as the colonial state filters down through some of these multiple sub-organizations. But it's also not the only influence in the rural economy. The colonial state, it is competing with the existing habits and behaviors of farmers. So we also need to think about when and why these associations and the new forms of agriculture promoted by the government, when and why do these become significant for Korean cultivators? And there are a range of answers to that question that include, but are not limited to, questions of class or nationality. So it's important to recognize that because some of these questions, they do outlast the end of colonial rule in 1945. After liberation, farmers still need to sell their crops. They still need to seek new sources of credit and materials, and they're still engaging with international markets and modern agriculture. So even though many of these changes, they are associated with colonial policy, that's not the only frame against which we need to understand these changes. That is the end of my talk. I think we can come to questions after the break. So I'll stop sharing the screen and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Holly. Yeah, I think this was a very unique insight, zooming in on well, a case that maybe, yeah, was not on your radar before. Let's establish that afterwards, after the break. I would say we will meet at, well, 5 past now. 5 past half, well, 35. At 35 after a quarter of an hour. So enjoy the break and let's meet then again. So I will mute myself.
Recording in
Who was talking?